So Kevin did say that you in secret. He used to come here in the 90s when he was over here for research leave, and he said that he thought one day I'll give a paper at the long history of the British British history in the long 18th, and so he's finally here. I'm pleased to be here. So for those of you who don't know Kevin Siena is Professor of History at Canada's Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. He specialises in the history of medicine and disease in the 17th and 18th centuries. His first book was a study of syphilis and the London poor, venereal disease, hospitals, and the urban poor, London's foul wards, 1600 to 1800, published in 2004. In 2005, he was the editor of Sins of Flesh, Responding to Sexual Disease in Early Modern Europe. And in 2013, he co-edited, along with Jonathan Reinhardt, A Medical History of Skin. His most recent book, Rotten Bodies, published in 2019, Class and Contagion in 18th Century Britain, explored how panics about typhus outbreaks led to biological constructions of class. And it was the exploration of those medical rhetorics about disease and the construction of difference that led to his current project on disease and race, and indeed on which he'll be speaking about this evening. So, Kevin, how are you?
My paper is kind of pushing up against my time limit, so I won't say much to start other than that it really is a treat and an honor to be here. I started coming in 1997 when I was over doing my dissertation research, and I didn't think that it would take close to 30 years to actually get around to delivering a paper, but I'm really glad to be invited. All right, on with it. Please work. In 1775, the German anatomist Johann Blumenbach reflected on the issue of hereditary predisposition to disease. It was a concept, he argued, that carried significance far beyond its usual discussions within medicine. Discussing racial degeneration, he exclaimed, an hereditary disposition to disease would seem at first sight rather to belong to the pathology than the natural history of animals. But when the matter is more carefully looked into, it is plain that in more ways than one, it has something to do with those causes of degeneration we are concerned with. 4 years later, the Manchester physician Charles White similarly suggested that the topic of disease bore significantly on understandings of race, declaring, these remarks upon diseases seem to prove that there are original differences in the constitutions of white Europeans, the Negroes, and the Indians, end quote. Now, although both were physicians, neither made their claims in treatises about disease or health. Rather, their claims came from their contributions to the late 18th century debate on the so-called varieties of man. Should I hold up to? No, keep going. We're good. Okay. The apparent differences between groups of people around the world invited explorations from a wide range of thinkers to produce a body of thought that anticipated the coming of anthropology. If the people of the globe were different, how different were they, and how?
Sorry.
Thank you. If the people around the globe were different, how different were they? How might those differences be cataloged and explained, etc.? Those questions were taken up by luminaries like Rousseau, Hume, and Kant, as well as a bevy of slightly lesser known writers like White. And of course, these questions would continue to fascinate through the 19th century. A close survey of this literature demonstrates the surprising and heretofore unappreciated role played by pathology, the science of disease. As White and Blumenbach begin to suggest, Enlightenment-era writers on human variety frequently discussed disease, whether as evidence of essential difference, as it was for White, or even as the cause of that difference, as it was for Blumenbach. Indeed, that difference between them, I'm going to suggest, mattered with regard to whether various thinkers were monogenists, like Blumenbach, or polygenists, like White. That is, whether they argued, like Blumenbach, that all humans stemmed from a single act of creation, or whether they believed, like White, that the races were each created separately, and thus that racial difference was unbridgeable. Whatever the case, as debates over slavery escalated in the late 18th century, the science of pathology took on new salience within the wider, rapidly intensifying project to identify and explain human difference. And is this dialogue between the arena of medicine and the emerging science of man that forms the focus of my current project. I'm building, of course, on foundational scholarship in this area. We know that medicine was heavily implicated in early formulations of biological race. Although here, studies have tended to focus on the science of anatomy, with its measurements of craniums and the like. Indeed, Blumenbach is much better known for his studies of skulls and skeletons than for his comments on disease. Well, I want to suggest that contributions from pathology, the branch of medicine devoted to disease, may have been just as important to the early architects of race. Here I'm building on the work of Suman Seth's book, Difference and Disease, which similarly tries to shift our attention from racial physiology to racial pathology, suggesting that what he calls 18th century race medicine was a vital precursor of later 19th century race science. Scholars like Seth, as well as Rana Hogarth and Mariela Espinosa, have demonstrated that theories about differential susceptibility to disease and different patterns of morbidity provided a fertile arena for the making of race in the late 18th century. And the classic case in this regard is yellow fever. Hogarth and Espinosa have explored the racially charged history of that disease, which appeared to some contemporaries to strike Black and white bodies differently, with physicians presenting Black immunity to yellow fever as a hard scientific fact. And in this way, they show pathology helped make race real. I seek to bolster and enhance this scholarship in two main ways. On the one hand, I want to push beyond the genre of medical treatises on this or that disease and pursue the trail of medical theories about pathology into the philosophical, natural historical, and proto-anthropological works that debated human diversity. In other words, I want to get out of the strictly medical text and see where these theories went and what work they did within the larger scaffolding of early race theories. Secondly, though, and this is where I'm going to start and spend probably half my time, I want to ask a more fundamental question, namely, what made disease so useful to these debates? The topic of disease is consistently present in the treatises on human variety. Virtually every major contributor to the debate, many of whom were not physicians, eventually came around to discussing disease at some point. And indeed, Suman Seth has recently shown that none other than Darwin remained obsessed with the project to correlate race and disease throughout his career. Why? What afforded disease such enormous potential for talking about human difference in the 18th century? Off of my.
Yes. Now trying. There we go.
All right. Should work. So what afforded disease such enormous potential for talking about human difference? Central to this question and to my larger project is a concept that I'm calling formativity. Enlightenment-era doctors held that disease had the power to transform bodies in durable, long-lasting, and even permanent ways. Despite doctors' boasts about their ability to cure diseases, physicians' theoretical frameworks often suggested that disease was not simply a temporary phase through which one passed, but rather it was a force that fundamentally altered the body, changed it, and left lasting impressions that would linger for years, lifetimes, and even generations. Disease had the power to mold bodies in permanent and even heritable ways. This is what I mean by its formativity. It gave form to things. Understanding this is going to require that we think about a series of fairly technical issues, fairly technical elements within early modern medical thought. These include the connections between disease and theories of reproduction, understandings of hereditary diseases, theories on what we would call susceptibility, but which they called predisposition, and finally, theories about immunity. And we're going to see that by the later 17th century, all of these had developed in ways to forge powerful links between the science of pathology and the early science of heredity. I will get to race, I promise, but before we do, I want to spend some time explaining how disease came to carry such profound implications for heredity, which then in turn allowed it to influence discussions of race. So let's start with reproduction. Best known for discovering circulation, William Harvey's 1651 Anatomical Exercitations on the Generation of Animals is considered by many to be the most important 17th century treatise on the topic. Always an anatomist, Harvey based his study on dissections, and importantly, he found that post-coital dissections of animals showed no presence of the male seed in the womb. And he wondered, how could the male seed promote any kind of effect on the female egg, let alone something as extraordinary as generation, if it was not physically present? How might it have some kind of effect over a distance? He drew his answer from pathology. All animals whatsoever, which arise from male and female, are generated by the coition of both sexes, and so begotten, as it were, per contagion a la quod, by a kind of contagion. In like manner, as physicians observe that contagious diseases like these ones do propagate their infection. Of so great operation and energy is contagion, and perhaps the same thing obtains in the generation of animals. He seems speculative here, but this was not an aside. Harvey asserted the point throughout the book. Whatever the invisible force was that caused generation, he was adamant about what it should be called. Therefore, till it be determined what the efficient of the egg is, give me leave to call it contagion, or elsewhere, the fetus is made by contagion. Importantly for Harvey, and certainly for me, reproduction and contagion were not comparative metaphors for one another. They represented the same force operating by the same principles. Now, Harvey was pushed to think in these terms thanks to the dominance of seeds in contagion, in theories of contagion. From the time of Galen up through Renaissance thinkers like Fracastoro, semina were held responsible for spreading disease, with seeds of fever or seeds of plague providing crucial explanatory mechanisms for epidemics before the age of bacteriology. The seed provided a very useful mechanism to explain disease because seeds transferred properties. Seeds were nature's delivery systems, allowing the qualities of one plant or animal to be transmitted to another. And this is how they understood contagion operating. Tiny particles entered the body and began transferring their qualities to that body. In this way, then, the generative and the pathological were conceptually linked long before Harvey. Now, disease also had an important position in discussions of procreation because many diseases were understood to pass from parent to child. Such elements played a prominent role in Harvey's theory of generation, especially as examples within his explanations of how traits transmitted, as here. Just in this manner is the son born like the father, and the virtues which do ennoble a family, and the hereditary vices also, are sometimes after many generations transported to posterity. Some diseases also produce their like in other subjects, like these ones. But what talk I of diseases since succession hath at a vast remove repeated the very moles, warts, and scars which the great grandsires formerly wore. Now, it's important here that Harvey stressed that these traits passed over many generations, suggesting a powerful multi-generational hereditary quality. For Harvey, disease was not something that just came and went. And when he spoke about contagion and its power over the body, its power to sort of affect the body, he talked about what he called contagion's formative faculty. And this is where you can see the foundation for my term formativity comes from. Seeds and diseases gave their form to things. Now, I still need to chart the development of Harvey's line of thought on generation much more closely over the ensuing century, but consider that even at the dawn of the 19th century, texts on reproduction like this one were still citing him directly. Quote, the matrix conceives the fetus by a species of contagion. Now, the mechanisms of how hereditary diseases operated are particularly important for us to understand. Most hereditary diseases did not show themselves until much later in life. 17th and 18th century doctors typically argued that children did not inherit a disease from their parents, but rather they inherited the seeds of a disease which lay dormant until some stimulus ignited them many years later. And the most common term for this inheritance was predisposition, the term Blumenbach used in the opening quotation. One could be born predisposed to an ailment that they might not ever suffer, but for which they carried this heightened risk throughout their lives. There were many diseases that were discussed in this way, including gout, scrofula, scurvy, a whole bunch. We can listen to the Oxford physician Thomas Willis describe the formation of a fetus from parents with scurvy. Quote, "The filthy taint being impressed on the genital humor becomes like an empoisoned ferment, which although it for a long time lies hid, at last exerts its power and inclines to the scorbutic taint." In this case, the genital humor tasked with transferring the parent's traits to the child convey height and eye color and a predisposition for scurvy all at once. These particles became bound to the infant's body at its first formation, fused to its constitution as an essential feature of its being. These formulations were common. The 18th century physician Richard Blackmore similarly explained how a parent's disease became part of a child's essential constitutional makeup. The causes of these distempers are either internal or external. The internal or cogenite causes may be interwoven and complicated with the material principles of the body at its first formation, as the seeds of many distempers are. For instance, these ones. His contemporary, the London physician Johann Grunfeld, spoke a similar language, noting that such seeds were conveyed from mother to fetus like a contagion, quote, like a contagion. And importantly, like Harvey, Grunfeld stressed that this process could spread over multiple generations. Quote, "It is not necessary that the father and mother should ever have a disease they received from their parents, but having a disposition to it from their progenitors or from some other cause, they may communicate it to their children." In other words, grandchildren inherited the seeds of a grandparent's disease, which had lurked in the reproductive essences of their parents, even though it never broke out. The parents never got sick. They were just the conduit between grandparent and grandchild. Scholars like John Waller, who have looked at hereditary diseases in the 18th century, have helpfully pointed out hereditary diseases' connections to incurability. This makes sense. What was a lowly physician to do when a disease was, to quote one physician, quote, "riveted into the principles of the Constitution from birth"? Pediatrician William Harris described the cause of hereditary diseases like this in 1742. "The hereditary morbific taint is so firmly impressed upon the tender stamina of the fetus and so intimately blended with all its parts that it is quite impossible for human art to remove it." So hereditary disease carried a powerful sense of permanence, and so too did the concept of predisposition. We saw in Willis's that these inherited seeds, quote, "lie for a long time hid." And we saw in the case of Grunfeld's parents that they never became sick, but the predisposition was always there. And my contention is that disease came and went, but predisposition was much more durable. And we're going to see that's the concept that's going to be really, really influential for later race theorists. Now, these theories were central to ideas regarding the greatest killer of the 18th century and the ultimate hereditary disease, smallpox. Smallpox was believed to arise from a universal human predisposition. Islamic doctors were the first to advance the idea, but it was held as authoritative in the 17th and 18th centuries by authorities like Willis. Quote, "The natural predisposition which inclines mankind to it seems to be a certain taint or impurity of the blood conceived in the womb with the first rudiments of the fetus." So he's talking about mankind now, he's not talking about individuals. The theory was grounded in long-standing menstrual taboos. It held that the fetus was formed and nurtured and therefore poisoned by menstrual blood, which inscribed its impurities on the fetus, which lay the seeds that would someday ignite into smallpox. So by this process, all humans were predisposed to smallpox. And mid-18th century commentaries show that this was still a popular view. I won't read this one out. So the passage of hereditary predisposition was thus not an occasional tragedy that happened to some families, but rather was a fundamental element of all human reproduction. Smallpox was also special because it conveyed a final element of what I'm calling disease's formativity, its ability to change bodies in long-lasting ways. Sometimes disease conveyed immunity. Enlightenment-era doctors explained this phenomenon in ways that arose from their thinking about predisposition. In this case, so hot was the fever in a smallpox, they argued, that it burned up all of the predisposing seeds in a kind of cleansing fire. So subsequent exposure to smallpox had no effect because the material it needed to ignite was now gone. I won't read this out, but you can see that Willis here declares that an immunity follows a smallpox because these predisposing particles are all consumed. So whereas other diseases left their dangerous seeds and predispositions behind, smallpox worked oppositely. It started as a hereditary predisposition. It started as a pathology, and then it left behind a kind of cleansing immunity. It was not the only disease that could do that. Measles, which Willis mentions here, could also confer immunity. And there was considerable discussion in the 18th century about a disease they called the seasoning sickness. This was a species of fever that newcomers to the tropics were believed to suffer during their first year in the new environment. And the action of that disease on the system, if you survived it, was believed to alter your constitution and adapt it to your new home by developing newly acquired resistance to local diseases. So one more way that disease could sort of change the body and restructure it in an enduring way was through this development of immunity. So disease was bound up with conceptions of reproduction and heredity. It was thought capable of changing the body in durable, long-lasting, and heritable ways. Okay, what does any of that have to do with race? We've been very patient, so let's shift gears. Disease played many roles in the debates on human variety. Since I've used up about half my time going over medical theory, I'm going to restrict my focus to just a few issues. The two issues that I mentioned at the outset, the presentation of disease as evidence of racial difference, and the argument that it was a cause of racial difference, as well as the idea that we saw in Harvey, that the passage of traits, in this case racial traits, and the transmission of hereditary disease represented two versions of the same process, that they were basically the same thing. Now, I'm looking at this fairly widely in my project, but this evening I want to focus on texts that came out of Edinburgh from the 1770s to about 1800 for reasons that I will explain. We can start with John Hunter's 1775 inaugural disputation on the varieties of man. Now, to clarify, he is frequently confused with the London surgeon of the same name, but this Hunter was an army physician. He took his degree at Edinburgh in 1775, the same year he published his disputation on race, suggesting that it was probably his thesis, but that's something I need to check. He went on to serve in Jamaica, and he published a well-known treatise on the health of Europeans in hot climates, which interestingly included a chapter on the diseases of Negroes. But what is interesting is that that book was published in 1788, meaning that his treatise on race came long before he'd spent any time in Jamaica. In other words, he developed his ideas on race while he was a student in Edinburgh. And that provides me a chance to talk about Edinburgh for a moment. The reason I'm particularly excited to look at these questions in Edinburgh is because it represented at once the premier medical school in Europe and a hotbed of racial theory. The Scottish Enlightenment is now understood to have been an important center of what we might call proto-anthropology. David Hume argued for fixed races as early as 1748, and then we see a long string of thinkers, Monboddo, Adam Ferguson, James Millar, William Robertson, Henry Lord Keynes. There's a host of Scottish historians and natural philosophers who took up the question of human variety in the 1770s to 90s. Many of them advanced what came to be known as stadial theory or four stages theory, which you're probably familiar with, but it was an immensely influential school of thought associated with Adam Smith, which posited that peoples advanced through various stages of civilization, from hunting, which was the earliest or savage stage, to herding, and then agriculture, and finally commerce. At each stage, we witness development, whether moral, intellectual, cultural, sexual, or importantly for my purposes, physiological. So, and with apologies for being extraordinarily brief, Edinburgh represented simultaneously the very best place in Europe to study medicine and a cutting-edge center for early thinking about race. And of course, it's that interaction between the medical and the anthropological that I'm fascinated with. And that mix was certainly on display in Hunter. Now, Hunter was a monogenist, and so he argued against the idea that the different races represented different species. Nevertheless, like almost all similar thinkers, he recognized different varieties within the human species. Indeed, he used the term race and variety interchangeably. He arranged them by skin color, and he counted them to 7. He thought there were 7 races. But before he described these different races, he began by outlining his general principles of heredity and how it worked. And when explaining the methods by which physical features were transmitted, he immediately noted the process of heredity, quote, is particularly shown by the history of disorders like gout, scrofula, and madness. Now, importantly, he presented these diseases not as mere analogs of racial traits, but, like Harvey, as their parallels that operated by the same principles. These diseases conditions must be looked on in the same light as other mutations of the corporal condition. And to speak of both from the same point of view, surely that change, which is the origin of the production of black skin, may just as easily be communicated by the parent to its offspring, and is no more difficult to explain than that by which gout is handed down in the same way. Nor is it all the more difficult to understand why the skin begins to grow black a certain time after birth than why some years afterwards the offspring of scrofulous parents is infected with ulcers. Hunter thus invokes some of the best known hereditary diseases, gout and scrofula, to convey the Harverian principle that hereditary diseases and physiological traits transferred in utero via the same process. This happened in the same way. Hunter was almost certainly here influenced by the French naturalist Buffon, whom he frequently referenced, and who advanced a similar claim about races, noting, quote, these varieties have been and still are perpetuated from generation to generation in the same manner as certain maladies pass from parents to children. Now, Bill Jenkins' study on dissertations on race at Edinburgh, at the University of Edinburgh, has suggested that Hunter's was one of the 2 most commonly cited texts on the topic, along with Blumenbach, with whom I started my talk, and whose own dissertation on human variety came out the very same year. You've already seen this quotation. Blumenbach was a degeneration theorist. He believed that all humans began white and that the other races formed by degenerating over time. And we saw that he advanced that an hereditary disposition to disease has something to do with the causes of degeneration. Well, how did that work? He explained this in a section entitled Racial Variety from Morbific Affection, explaining that when a disease passed through many generations, it, quote, shades sensibly away into a sort of second nature and gives rise to peculiar and constant varieties. He argued that exposure to disease gradually changed the body by producing immunity. Diseases, as we saw with the seasoning sickness, became like a second nature. The body became habituated to them. So Blumenbach took this very common principle from pathology and he applies it at the population level, and he imagines it operating over many, many generations, countless generations. In other words, he stretches the logic of an existing medical theory in both scope and time to present disease as an engine driving physiological change, change that he considered significant enough to warrant a new taxonomic position, a variety. And I should say there, this is a taxonomic term, variety, because Linnaeus, when he gives us his systema naturae, when he gives us taxonomy, he places man, Homo, that species, under it, he's got 4 varieties, by color. So this term variety is a taxonomic term. But this is a British seminar, so no more Germans. Let's get back to Edinburgh. 2 student organizations at the university organized salon-style debates with student members taking turns presenting dissertations at their monthly meetings. These were the Royal Medical Society and the Royal Physical Society. Students chose all kinds of topics to debate, but a survey of these dissertations demonstrates just how commonly they selected the question of human variety. This is a partial list of dissertations presented just to the Royal Medical Society, and it demonstrates how alive the question of human variety was at the university at this time. For example, it's pretty likely that Richard Miller's dissertation, that one there, was heavily influenced by Hunter's of 10 years prior. Miller presented the same hereditary diseases that Hunter had discussed, gout and scrofula, as examples of transmitted traits, and he made a fairly similar argument, placing hereditary disease and race side by side and indicating a sameness of process that these two shared. Quote, the various temperaments which distinguish different constitutions, we all know, are frequently communicated by parents to their offspring, as well as several morbid states of the body, those, for instance, that occasion gout and scrofula. May we not with equal reason conclude that the great causes which produce the varieties among mankind arising from color, shape, stature, etc., have likewise the power of inducing a peculiar state of the system, and that this state, like that originating from temperament or disease, may, like them, be propagated along with the species. Now, it's important that Miller here emphasizes predisposition to disease rather than the inherited disease itself. The children he describes are not born with gout or scrofula. They are born with the morbid states of the body that occasion those diseases. We saw earlier that while disease could be fleeting, predisposition was much more enduring. And it was precisely this sense of hereditarian durability that made predisposition such a useful concept for an early race theorist like Miller. Explaining population level change required mechanisms capable of operating over long stretches of time, and the persistent, lingering, heritable connotations associated with predisposition made it just such a mechanism. Miller's classmate, John Bradley, emphasized predisposition even more closely, more clearly in his 1791 Whence the Varieties of Human Species. Indeed, Bradley's claim is valuable for making several relevant points at once. Quote, it is argued by medical writers that in the case of hereditary diseases, it's not the disease itself that is transmitted in an embryo state from father to child, but only a certain conformation of the body or peculiar structure of the parts that constitutes predisposition. Let this opinion be allowed, and it will strongly corroborate our supposition. The child of the blackest Negro was born nearly white and does not for some time assume the dark hue of his progenitor. That is to say, the child is born with the strongest predisposition to the peculiarities of his parents, and upon the application of heat and other exciting causes, gradually adopts them. So Bradley, again, nicely emphasizes my earlier point that what is heritable is not the disease itself, but the predisposition. But what is perhaps his more surprising claim is that blackness itself was a heritable predisposition. Writers since Harvey had paired the inheritance of traits and the inheritance of disease, situating them side by side and claiming that they operated in the same manner. In Bradley, their merger is complete. They collapse upon one another. For Bradley, blackness is a predisposition operating exactly like an inherited pathology. The child is born with just the seeds of blackness, which activate over time when acted upon by external forces. So Bradley, again, redeploys a theory from pathology to explain race. However, he does so while making a subtle but profound change to that theory. Medical discussions of predisposition never presented disease as inevitable. To the contrary, a predisposition was only one factor that increased your risk of disease. And we saw that people could carry predisposition their whole life and never get sick. Bradley here transforms the concept with racial predisposition operating like biological destiny. External causes like heat only govern the pace at which, not whether, the child becomes black. There's a good chance that Bradley knew his fellow student Edward Home, who presented similar ideas to the same debating society just 2 years later. Home attributed racial differences to 3 causes and devoted a section of his dissertation to each, one to climate, one to customs, and a third to what he called the hereditary type, suggesting with this last factor a pretty fixed and transmissible sense of race. Now, he defined the hereditary type as either the appearance of traits in children that simply appeared immediately, or an hereditary disposition which enables the exciting causes to produce in the constitution similar effects, though applied in a less sensible degree. In other words, children either inherited traits that appeared immediately, or they inherited predispositions that appeared over time thanks to stimuli. Well, if the similarity to disease theory was not immediately clear, his very next words clarified the point, stating a familiar example of this was basically children born with a predisposition for scrofula, noting then that the predisposition to all hereditary diseases may be referred to the same cause. And then, like Bradley, he presented blackness itself as a predisposition. The children of Negroes born in a more temperate region than those of Africa supply a pertinent example of the influence of this principle on the complexion. Though born without color, soon after birth, they begin to assume the hue of their parents, and in point of color are perfect Negroes before the end of the 2nd week. So again, blackness is a predisposition. We can similarly excavate William Webb's dissertation presented the following year, but it would be pretty repetitive to do so. I'll just point out that he places the examples of disease and racial traits immediately side by side, as all of these guys seem to do. And he gives one of the clearest statements that they result from the same process. If you will allow me to highlight a pretty lengthy sentence and cut out some of the jargon, the sentence reads, "The inheritance of peculiarities distinguishing individual families in the same nation and the transmission from one generation to another of diseases are surely to be regarded as inferior degrees of the same principle in which the communication of climatical and national differences may be explained." Now, Webb, like most of his classmates, was pushing back on Keynes. The leading 18th century polygenic theorist, the Edinburgh jurist Henry Home Lord Keynes, had in 1774 controversially suggested that we do not all share a united ancestry, but rather that the races had all been products of different, distinct creation events, with each race created separately for a particular region of the globe. And this would form the main fault line within Edinburgh students' debates about race, which themselves were really a microcosm of the wider European debate on variety more generally, which also turned on this axis, polygenism or monogenism. For Keynes, the races were made physiologically distinct in order that each could thrive in their native climate. And here disease played an important role. Keynes used the apparent differences in disease patterns as evidence of these original distinctions. So the fact that, for example, Europeans sickened so easily in the Caribbean, or that Africans seemed immune to yellow fever, suggested to Keynes fundamental physiological difference. And while his position was a minority position, it did grow, and he did have supporters among Edinburgh students. In 1798, one such supporter, Alexander Robertson, presented to the Royal Medical Society a dissertation that cited Keynes directly and argued for the Keynesian position, quote, "There must originally have been created different pairs from which are derived the present varieties of man." What is notable is that disease plays a slightly less overt role for Robertson than it had for his classmates. He organized his paper by identifying and then countering specific arguments of the monogenists, essentially arguing that racial traits did not demonstrate the ability to change due to climate. Where disease came into the equation for him was to act, as it had for Keynes, as evidence of fixed difference. Proof that nature had created the races distinctly for different regions was the fact that people developed disease when they moved to radically new places. Just like many animals and vegetables fared poorly when you transplanted them to new climates, quote, so it is with respect to the varieties of men. In changing their climates, they become sickly and degenerate. Now, while thinkers like Blumenbach argued that disease and degeneracy caused racial difference, Robertson and Keynes presented it as evidence of racial difference. This is a subtle, but I think major distinction. Take the oft-discussed example of Europeans in the Caribbean. Doctors typically presented the seasoning sickness as a force that changed the body. The experience of having that disease reformed white colonist physiology and rendered them newly adapted to their new homes. And we saw that monogenists like Blumenbach took this principle and applied it over the longue durée, suggesting disease was a driver of racial change, slowly changing bodies that had once all been uniform. But that plasticity of the body presented a problem for polygenists like Robertson, because it suggested that the races might all merge into one another. Therefore, he takes the same phenomenon, Europeans getting fever in the West Indies, and instead he presents it as evidence that they were different to begin with fundamentally different physiologies to the native Caribbeans, who experienced altogether different patterns of morbidity. Perhaps most surprisingly, he made the same argument about Africans transplanted to the West Indies. Robertson related a case reported by Buffon of women from Senegal who gave birth in the slightly cooler French West Indies. Like the West Indies were hot, but Senegal was hotter. And reportedly, their infants, quote, had to be kept for the first 9 days after birth in close, warm chambers because they are liable to a fatal tetanus from too early exposure to the air. Right? So like the fact that they get sick there, it demonstrates that they're different from the people who live there. This position differed markedly from the scores of doctors who Suman Seth has shown presented Africa and the Caribbean as environmentally identical. They were both tropical. Of course, that position supported the argument that Africans were fit for slavery there because they were already accustomed to any tropical locale. So this point of departure had important ramifications, and thus Robertson is arguing pretty significantly against the grain here. That said, Robertson didn't go so far as to suggest that Africans shouldn't labor in the Caribbean, but he did point out that they frequently got sick. Again, striving to prove essential racial difference. In this case, not the difference between Europeans and Africans, but the difference between Africans and native Caribbeans. He highlighted Africans' high mortality rates in the Caribbean like this, quote, in our own colonies, notwithstanding all the care that is taken of the slaves, importation is still necessary to keep up the requisite stock. He then repeated warm climates are an almost certain grave to Europeans, before moving on to make his larger polygenic argument that this evidence he thought pointed to. From these circumstances, I think it appears probable that the northern and southern nations are of a different origin, adapted each by nature at their first great creation to their respective countries. And this, I think, unveils a basic difference in how 18th century writers deployed disease in their treatises on human variety. This hypothesis is very tentative. This whole paper is very tentative, but this hypothesis is very tentative and it needs more testing. But writers like Robertson, Keynes, and Charles White, who I mentioned at the introduction, they didn't rely quite as heavily on disease as did the monogenists, and they used disease in a different way. Discussions of how disease transformed the body, what I call its formativity, were much more prominent in the work of the monogenists. And this makes some sense. To them, all bodies started out exactly the same. Thus, they were tasked with explaining how bodies changed and how those changes became enduring and heritable. And disease, as I tried to show in the first half of the lecture, was really useful for doing both of those things, right? Change the body and change the body in heritable ways. This is why we see virtually every one of them emphasizing theories of predisposition and extending the logic of those theories to the population level and imagining them operating over thousands of years. But the polygenists, on the other hand, needed to show that the body was resistant to change, and that at least some fundamental traits persisted regardless of environmental conditions. Of course, they accepted that bodies could change. Europeans tanned when they went to hot places, but they had to argue that these changes were incidental, passing, and most importantly, not heritable. So it was then that Robertson presents disease not as an enduring force that lingers in the body and makes its effects felt over decades and lifetimes. He presents it as a passing phenomenon. One of the specific theories that he attacked was the notion that blackness was the result of a permanent hereditary jaundice. This is a little technical. I'm sorry to have to kind of spring this on you late in the paper. But basically, because jaundice causes a discoloration of the skin, lots of 18th century doctors used it when talking about race, arguing that certain kinds of fevers in hot climate caused the body to produce too much bile, which resulted in this jaundice, and that over time, this perhaps became heritable and worked to darken the skin of brown and black people. So it's another version of a theory of how disease causes racial transformation. Robertson counters this argument in a way that is very interesting for our discussion. Quote, "Is it not absurd to attribute the color of a healthy Negro to the effects of a perpetual jaundice? Such a disease must occur from an absorption of bile, and to produce any lasting color, it must be perpetual. For the color which appears in a jaundice vanishes when the morbid state is removed. In order to forge a new race, a disease would have to have enduring effects." And this is precisely what we saw many thinkers advancing. Disease was long-lasting and durable. But for Robertson, disease is fleeting. Quote, "Jaundice vanishes when the morbid state is removed. For him, the fever ends, the patient is cured, the symptoms abate, and there is no discussion here of lingering seeds or heritable predispositions and all of that. Disease here is a much tidier affair. It's a very different representation of pathology." I've reached my conclusion. Obviously, disease was a tool. As such, it could be and was wielded selectively and put to lots of different uses by the thinkers who were debating race in the last third of the 18th century. I've got a few kites that I want to fly. Some are conclusions, some are kites. First, disease's formativity. Its ability to transform bodies in lasting ways made it a powerful tool for constructing identity categories in the 18th century. I got onto this and started looking into this and making a case that it performed this kind of work for class in my last book. And indeed, I've started to excavate the ways that race and class kind of intersected and cross-fertilized in the 18th century. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get that into this book or not. That might have to wait for its own study, but there definitely are connections that can be made there. In any case, secondly, if I am right, what I've been calling disease's formativity was a concept that most heavily influenced the monogenists, as I argued a moment ago. Those arguing for a shared ancestry of humanity looked to pathology for one of their key tools to explain how bodies shifted. They were able to do so because of the enduring complex links between disease and understandings of heredity that had been forged over at least the previous century. Now, monogenism, as I'm sure you all know, represented by far the majority opinion in the 18th century, meaning that disease's formativity influenced the vast majority of 18th century race theorists. And it's one of those things that once you know to look for it, you find it everywhere. Disease is omnipresent in these debates. Sooner or later, if you go through them, you'll find them talking about disease. Sometimes it's 300 pages into the text, but I don't think I found any who simply make no comment on it. It's an element of this debate. Thirdly, the monogenists are often portrayed or thought of as sort of holding back or delaying the onset of scientific racism. a concept which is more commonly associated with polygenesis. Monogenism suggested a shared humanity on the one hand, and a plastic, malleable physiology on the other hand. Monogenic bodies could change, polygenic bodies were fixed. However, the increasingly heavy reliance on medical theories had the effect to render monogenic presentations on race increasingly scientific and grounded in the expert language of medicine. The differences between people were not merely cultural, but were powerfully physical, and those differences lay far deeper within the murky interior of the body than just the surface level of the skin. The monogenists were thus just as scientific as the polygenists were in the 18th century, and given their heavier reliance on pathology, maybe even more so. There's a kite. Moreover, many monogenic theorists presented racial distinction as virtually as fixed as their polygenic opponents. In theory, they described bodies that change due to environmental conditions, but it was highly theoretical. Indeed, some of the monogenists who relied most heavily on disease to explain how race developed presented the races as either now permanently fixed, which is what Kant argued, and I could do a whole thing on Kant, but again, he's not British. So Kant argued that the races, he's a monogenist, but he argues that once the races were formed, now they're kind of fixed and permanent, they're not changing. Or others describe the process of change as so gradual that for all intents and purposes, they were virtually unbridgeable. Samuel Stanhope Smith, whose comments on disease could easily fit in this paper, suggested that it would take at least 1,000 years for racial transformation to take place, meaning no one in Europe really needed to worry about racial slippage anytime soon. And of course, they all arranged the races hierarchically. Suman Seth has convincingly argued that once the challenge of abolition grew from the 1770s, we see the quick onset of polygenism, with discourses on disease helping to contribute to presentations of Africans as different species. However, in that same period, we also see a kind of hardening, scientifically based white supremacist monogenism as well, which suggests to me, perhaps at a certain point, the distinction between the monogenist and the polygenist might be rather academic. There's maybe the splitting of a very fine hair there. Still, that distinction mattered at the time, and it would continue to frame these debates throughout the 19th century. I'm on point 4. And so it is that we continue to see thinkers, some of the most important thinkers on the question, like Pritchard and even Darwin, supporting monogenic theories via heavy reliance on claims about disease. The debate I described this evening was far from over, and disease continued to play a central role. It's potentially telling that both of these thinkers studied medicine at Edinburgh, and both of them were members of the Royal Medical Society. Pritchard presented the first version of his thoughts as a dissertation to the society in 1807, and Darwin became a member when he arrived as a medical student in 1825. Thus, he would have almost certainly heard and debated dissertations quite like the ones that I explored this evening, which would continue to be presented to the society throughout the first half of the 19th century. Finally, and lastly, it's tempting to see the coming of scientific theories of race as a hallmark of modernity. But when we look at the role played by disease in these debates, we are struck by how indebted late 18th century thinkers were to early modern concepts. The idea that disease was foundational to conceptions of heredity, that diseases and traits passed by the same exact process, that disease could change the body in lasting ways, and that these changes could become heritable. All of these ideas were worked out by the middle of the 17th century. Their presence, and indeed their centrality to cutting-edge debates at the dawn of the 19th century suggests the value of remaining alert to much longer continuities. Thank you.